Welcome to Boss Builds, where we here at Dungeonmancers take ordinary monsters and make them extraordinary. Today, we talk Merrow. Now, I am joined here with our glorious Mick Daggers. Now, I understand you've had your fair share of trials and tribulations with these fine creatures called Merrow. What are these? What makes a Merrow?
Yes, so Merrow are interesting creatures in that they're aquatic, of course. They're humanoid. They have relatively humanoid characteristics. They are not bipedal, as most humanoids. They're actually, their low halves are more fish-like, more mermaid-like. Um, and so the reason for that is a Merrow. This is uncommon knowledge to the regular denizens of the material plane. They are actually transformed merfolk by demon magics. They're actually somewhat beholden to Demigorgon, the demon lord, and through his magics, they were transformed into the vicious creatures that they are. So yes, they are humanoid in nature, and they use weaponry much like most humanoids do. They do not speak the common tongue. They speak Aquan mostly. So communicating with them, especially if you are kind of utilizing them in your own dungeons, can be a challenge. But with use of good magics or a proper translator, a lot of things can get done.
Yes,
So yes, Merrow art, they're so interesting, and they're a lot of fun to work with and utilize against, well, unsuspecting adventurers.
Mhm. Yes. What are see? We understand that they are sort of merfolk, so do they mostly reside in strictly oceans, or can they be found coastal and rivers and lakes?
I'm suppose there are always variants on that, but they're mostly found in the deep parts of the ocean. They come from the abyss, and so their natural sort of habitat would be the deep, dark places of the aquatic plains.
Hmm,
Um,
all the scary
but
parts.
there is no reason. Yeah, the scary parts. There's no reason why you couldn't put them in, let's say, uh, a deep lake, or perhaps they could be something like pirates fording rivers and things of that nature.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, their one prerogative is hunger. That's what drives them as creatures. And so, under dire circumstances, they could go to different environments, and it's perfectly plausible for them to do that.
I like to think that they're always quite versatile and know a little invasive in my mind. Um,
Mm.
they take any territory that they can get their fins on. Um, what what are some attributes and reasons why you would enjoy using Merrow and pit them against some lowly adventurers?
So, the best thing I think about Merrow is that um, there's something sinister about how how they're composed, what they are. They are humanoid in nature, and when you're out on a seafaring adventure, when you anticipate facing something dangerous, you're going to anticipate facing creatures, sharks, squids, um, and maybe in like deep cavernous places, you might face things like a Kuatoa and things like that. Those are less daunting in appearance. Whereas when you're facing off with Merrow, they look relatively humanoid. They're reflections of land dwellers, um, and they're very, wicked looking. And not only that, they tend to run in pack.
Hmm.
Merrow tend to have several in a group, in militaristic kind of
Yes.
formations. And so whenever you run across a Merrow, you're not fighting one, you're fighting many. So
Yes,
it's really fun.
the whole group mentality is something that I think is typically underutilized when facing off against monsters other than goblins and kobolds. I think that a lot of people neglect and overlook that group mentality that a lot of monsters do actually have, Merrow being one of them, um, which is
Mm,
something that I would love to include when you are fighting them. It's fun to have one big, beefy boss monster, but that is far too easy to
mm,
have just tunneled focus and everybody is making all their attacks at one creature. One simple Merrow
mm,
will not be able to stand an assault from anything more than a level 1 group for very long.
mm.
Um, so having
Yeah, and
multiple of these guys throwing their harpoons and just getting all over the place is going to be quite necessary when encountering these folk.
yeah, it's a great way to set a challenge for players, for adventurers. And one of the markers I think of utilizing a good creature, um, to up the difficulty level is if a creature has multi attack. Multi
Mm-hmm.
attack is a good way to know if a creature you're stepping away from a lower level challenge to an upper level challenge. And when you have a creature that has multi attack and you compound it with other creatures when they're working in not pack tactics by the book, but pack
Yes.
tactics in a more strategic sense, um, those numbers start to really stack up. And so Merrow are great for that. Merrow, they aren't lower in intelligence. They're not like beast level
Yes.
low, but they do understand basic strategy, and so you can utilize them. You can corner your adventures. You can set traps, and having that group mentality, that pack tactic, can really, especially like if you've got them funneled, if you've got them bottlenecked in a cave somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
it can really lay some hurt on adventures. That's a lot of fun, because you can set a challenge, a puzzle for them from a tactical standpoint.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that's chronically overlooked is the statistics that you find in the monster manual aren't the statistics for every single individual creature. That is a base line. Most Merrow might only be what I believe is a 7 or a 6 in intelligence, but not every single Merrow is going to have that level of intelligence. Some are going to be smarter. Some, especially if they're a
Mm,
leader, are going to have higher intelligence, likely a higher charisma score. They are going to know
mm.
how to use strategy and manipulate, traps in combat and use funnels. Don't take them as a simple beast because they are not.
They're absolutely not. They are humanoids, and they will think as we typically imagine humanoids would. Um, and you're absolutely right. They are intelligent, and you can utilize those intelligence, or charisma or wisdom
Mm-hmm.
modifiers to give them more interesting spins. Merrill, as just as like their base stat block, they're fighters, which is fine. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that. But they have opportunity, I think, to evolve into more interesting variants, such as the 100% can be warlocks. They
Mm-hmm.
are intrinsically attached to Demigorgon, the demon lord. So there, there's just a straight and narrow path towards
Direct
warlock.
connection.
And then also sorcerers, the same vein, having a
Mm-hmm.
natural connection to some kind of powerful being. Um, and why not druids? I mean, they could have a natural connection to the watery elements. I think it's, you have to be a little bit creative with developing that, but a fearsome druid Merrow boss would be an amazing um, kind of variant on what it is to fight Merrow.
Speaking of which, I think that we should go into some legitimate abilities that we can give a boss fight that you might encounter with a Merrow. I know that you mentioned briefly with warlocks and druids, a very, very easy way to up the ante a little bit, especially as a druid. Give your give one of the Merrow that you are facing off against, have one of them be a spellcaster with conjure animals, and they maybe conjures a bull shard or two, and you can. That's an easy way to introduce a little bit of an extra challenge. They have a target that they can break concentration and get rid of those animals, or they can just deal with the animals outright. Very, very easy, simple way that you can introduce a little bit of variety and challenge and tactic immediately into the fight with one single spell.
Absolutely. And I think that stays with the same idea that we introduced earlier, in that Merrow do not operate alone. Typically, they do travel in groups and pack, and having one with the ability to summon, sea creatures.
Mm-hmm.
I think that falls in line with that strategic way that Merrow operate. And another kind of, and this is touching back on like environmental tactics as
Mm-hmm.
well as natural abilities. Let's say you get into a dungeon and you start working your way towards the lair of this Merrow boss. Humanoid, they are smart enough that they can set traps and things as well. It doesn't have to be a slog through a dungeon where you just fight one group after another. They are intelligent enough that they will set traps for adventurers to fall into, and make for a faster meal for the Merrow, as it were. So,
Absolutely. I was
that's
actually
something to consider.
speaking like of traps. That kind of makes me think of, you know, you're in some watery, circular cavern. You're fighting these Merrow, and maybe they have some sort of like net traps in the ceiling that when passed by a glyph comes out, or you trip a part of the water that the current just doesn't flow right as you swim past it, and it trips a 5 foot wide net, big enough to capture a medium sized creature. And maybe you have an entire hallway, or the room is littered with these 5 foot wide nets that maybe they have to make a dexterity save after they pass that spot. And it can be an easy dexterity save too. It can, this is a net floating through water. However, they don't have the best swimming speed, most likely. Maybe it's only a DC 13 dex save, and to not get caught in this net, one of your players is probably bound to get caught in a net and is gonna fall prey to taking some attacks of advantage and have to break out of the net.
Yeah, and that's another. It makes perfect sense logically. Merrow would want to separate their prey. They would want to isolate them and make them easier to capture and kill. So, I think something like a net trap, or something that maybe destabilizes the structural integrity of a layer, maybe talking about druids, they have several spells that can manipulate stone and water and things of that nature. So you can use that. Players love to use shape water and things like that to create circumstances where they don't have to cast a spell to cause damage. But let's say you have a boss that is, we didn't say it, but maybe a cleric or a druid. They want to shape earth and cause a little bit of a rock slide underwater. Well, they can do that just as well as a player can.
Absolutely.
And that is kind of a trap or a mechanic that you can give that honestly I think is a little bit overlooked. And even then, it doesn't even have to be something from the compendium or the DM's guide or whatever. It can be a lair action that you write yourself with the boss. Maybe it causes an underwater landslide or something to that effect.
And
I think
on
that
initiative count 20 or 10 causes underwater, like the roof to kind of collapse in on itself. That'd be very interesting.
It's true. And something else to note, I am fresh off of creating a wonderfully sinister underwater campaign, and underwater fighting mechanics are very important for utilizing anything underwater, but especially Merrow. And Merrow typically will use harpoons or tridents, things like that, as their weapons, which are unaffected by underwater combat detriments. So make sure as a DM, as a dungeon crafter, you listeners and watchers, that stick with those underwater fighting mechanics, because that's going to up the challenge immensely.
Yes, that is. Ensure that you definitely read the underwater combat section of the DMG before you introduce any sort of water combat, because it is quite a bit different from standard combat. There are many varying rules, and a couple rules that aren't really covered that you're going to have to decide for yourself how you want to take it, such as with spellcasting. It is very unclear with spells if you can cast them in water or if you cannot when it has a verbal component. That is a table by table basis, and however the dungeon master may feel about that particular topic is how it will have to be handled.
And I think introducing, well, let's say you have a higher level party. They find out that there is some treasure that is deep within some cave just off the coast. This is the opportunity for you as a dungeon crafter to introduce Merrow and introduce underwater fighting mechanics. I think, narratively speaking, Merrow are perfect for challenging players and introducing them to water-based mechanics if they've never faced it before.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I think it's great. I did want to return back to the idea of how to create like a big bad boss.
Yes.
I think we've framed what it is to have like a Merrow-based environment. But what does a big, scary Merrow leader look like?
Now, a boss Merrow in itself shouldn't just be a standard Merrow with a harpoon. In my opinion, you should have some extra little abilities. It should be, these are water-faring creatures. Why not allow it to manipulate the water around it? As, Merrow don't standard have a bonus action. Perhaps as a bonus action, it can cause a whirlpool that, envelops one of the characters and, give it a 30 or 60 foot range, so that, that ranged rogue who's sitting there with his crossbow trying to just get sneak attack every round gets enveloped in a whirlpool for a round or however long you end up deciding that whirlpool will last, and he's caught in this little whiplash. Or perhaps you're able to cause a riptide. He's able to pull the fighter or the barbarian away from his melee combat range by riptiding him away 10 feet or 15 feet.
Yes, movement mechanics are so important in underwater combat because you can fight everyone in 3
Mm-hmm.
dimensions, and being able to, I think it makes perfect sense that Merrow can manipulate water. That is their domain,
Yes.
especially with some more powerful. These kind of maybe they're a group leader or they're a boss, and it would make perfect sense that they could do something that manipulates water, and being able to control the field of combat is
Mm-hmm.
very important, because if your players have played together for quite some time, they are going to have their favorite strategies that they manipulate and or that they utilize, and being able to break up that strategy is more fun for you as a DM, as a dungeon crafter. But it's also more fun for your players too, because they have to think on their feet or their fins.
Yes. One thing that before you ever enter combat with a Merrow, I don't believe that a Merrow would ever be dumb enough to take its fight onto land where it can only move 10 feet. In my mind, the the player characters would come into some sort of, maybe it's low tide and they're able to enter this cave, and you have a Merrow shaman or something of the like, and there's these pools that you can see that there is a further cavern of cave systems beneath the water, and perhaps the shaman's able to like summon the power of the full moon or the high tide and fill that upper cave up with water, enveloping the player characters. And I'm sure that some you know bodyguard Merrow would be hurling some of their javelins and trying to yank people into the pools beneath. They don't allow your characters to fight the ground on their terms. They are going to have to come into the water and deal with those water combat tactics and deal with getting yanked by the javelins of the Merrow.
Yes, and that is really, I think, the pillar of what Merrow are, is they want to control the situation. They won't just blindly rush into combat. And I will say there's one situation that I've actually utilized with Merrow. The only situation I can imagine them going above the water, and that is, let's say your adventurers have a ship and they're
Mm-hmm.
sailing casually, and they are suddenly under attack, and the Merrow could be boarding their ship. But I think you have to add an extra condition in this case, that they're utilizing a giant squid or something like that to
Mm.
sink the ship. And so these Merrow are effectively distracting the fighters, your adventurers, so that the giant squid can sink the ship. And so they have all of the riches from the ship. They
Oh,
have,
yes.
all of the the good food in form of people. Um, and so I think that would be a situation where it is viable and sensical to have Merrows go above the water, um, because it is an isolated environment. You're
Yes.
not traveling far on a ship, um, but
Mm-hmm.
also their first priority is bringing that ship down below.
No, absolutely. I
Yeah.
really enjoy the imagery of octopus tentacles coming out of the water, attacking a ship while dealing with a small strike team of Merrow.
It's a scary thought, and your players are going to think oh, this is very cool, but also very deadly,
Mhm.
especially if they're on a ship and they don't have things like potions of water breathing or
Mm.
cloaks of the manta ray. Water is a huge peril for individuals who aren't native to it. So
For most
something
PCs who are
to
not
consider.
a water genasi, a Triton, if you don't have that swim speed, they're not going to want to get in the water. You almost have to force them into the water most of the time when it comes to water combat. One thing that I really
Yeah.
love about Merrow is the just part of the lore about them is they tie the bodies of their victims into kelp in their dwellings and where they live. It would be interesting if they had some sort of
Mm,
manipulation over this kelp, or the kelp actually helped them in their battles. Maybe they fight in a tall kelp forest, and your vision is obscured if you're further than 15, 20 feet away from them because it's just so dense. So you're forced to get close in order to fight them because you quite literally cannot see them if you are not. And perhaps they're able to entwine you with the kelp. Maybe the kelp is a lair action on an initiative count 20 or 10 that can kind of tie up some of the people as they swim through.
absolutely. And that's another thing is the using the environment. Especially you mentioned as a layer action, almost any spellcaster you can make that work.
Yes.
Um, let's say you're in the lair of the boss, and even as a warlock, you don't necessarily associate warlocks with you know w- with manipulating nature, but it's plausible.
Yeah.
Um, there's a UA variant, lurker in the deep type
Hmm.
warlock um, that that makes sense. But also, you don't have to necessarily subscribe to specific classes. Maybe they're just an underwater war mage or something like that. That is your Merrow boss, and you, as the dungeon crafter, as the writer of the framework of this story, for your players to help facilitate them, you get to create whatever you want. That's the wonder of D&D. So,
One thing that I do find very odd about the standard harpoon attack that a Marrow gets is the
mm,
fact that it doesn't impose a restrained condition. It doesn't impose any sort of condition, even though they are effectively grappled once they've been hit by this. It kind of negates the fact that they have been pierced and yanked, and this thing is
mm,
still inside of and embedded in them. They
mm,
don't cover that in the stat block. That is something that you should probably take into account, especially if you're dragging people into water. They are likely at least restrained, giving them
mm.
a debuff to their movement speed by having a little harpoon in their body yanking them along.
Absolutely. And that, if you think about your combat narratively, if you're kind of running that little movie in your head,
Mm-hmm.
as I think that's the best thing about D&D. That makes perfect sense. If you've got a harpoon strike that's through and through with a barbed edge, you know, it's not going to come out easily. And
Definitely not.
so that can be a mechanic. You don't have to introduce it to
Not every single one
every
of them has
strike
to have it.
by Merrow. Yeah. Yeah. But definitely your big bads, you're kind of the lieutenants who lead the groups of Merrow, or your boss, even
Mm-hmm.
if they have like a large, like a whaling harpoon.
Oh yeah.
I think that is something that would be very scary and very cool mechanically.
You
You
can
mentioned
even.
that ranged rogue earlier.
Oh yeah.
If they get harpooned and get sucked in to melee range, well, that rogue is probably not feeling too good by that point.
They're gonna want to get out of there very fast, but they're gonna have to rip this harpoon out of them first.
If you want to be particularly mean, if you've got a group that has been very, precocious, players love to do things like, stick their weapons into their enemies and use things like heat metal.
Yes, they do.
If you want to punish your group a little bit, why not give a Merrow spellcaster heat metal? But I would say use that cautiously, because that is very powerful and
quite brutal.
Quick way to end his life.
Make sure that they're of an appropriate level or particularly effective.
Yeah, give them the exit mechanic. Always have an answer to the puzzle, just don't always make it too obvious.
And you could even make it simple as like maybe they don't have to make a dexterity or a strength check to pull themselves off, but they're gonna take some damage. They can pull themselves off definitively, but they're gonna take damage doing so.
Right.
Or you can go the other way and just have it be like most things in 5e, an acrobatics or an athletics check or strength or dex save to pull themselves off.
Yeah, and these are the kind of things you can add a little spice to just the regular stat block, and that's the whole idea of these videos of boss builds, is taking these regular enemies and making them extraordinary, making them something more than they were, and you as the DM, you get to do that.
It's your world, your Merrow. They act however you want to make them act.
Absolutely.
One thing that I love about that inspires me as part of the artwork of Merrow is this: they have this massive, flourishing, strong tail as part of their artwork. And I feel like it should just be able to be utilized in some way. They should be able to do like a tail whip that batters somebody back into a wall or something of the like. They should be able to use some sort of like shove attack with their tails, something. They have these immense muscular tails, and the artwork looks amazing for them. And I just wish sometimes that they would utilize some of those very cool, interesting features that these creatures have.
Well, and that I absolutely agree in that you can do so much with that. You could do a shove, you can do a whip attack, you can actually grapple, you can constrict, much like a snake might. So, yeah, I think utilizing the tail is, especially with a boss, a boss of a larger frame.
Absolutely.
They're going to have a longer tail, and you can use those mechanics to as part of a multi-attack. You don't have to use just the standard 2 harpoon attacks. You can throw in a tail whip or something to that effect.
Easy getaway.
Or even as a legendary action, you can use your legendary action to grapple with your tail if they're within 10 feet of melee range,
Oh man, that would be that inspires like a picture of like a Merrow with like an eel under half grappling some barbarian, and as a legendary action causing like a shocking grasp or something like that with his tail.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I think that's
that'd be very cool.
That's so fun.
Yeah, so overall, I feel like Merrow lend themselves very well to things like traps. There's a lot of ocean faring monsters that just don't feel like traps work very well with them. Merrow are definitely the exception to this. They definitely feel appropriate to use traps, and it feels very appropriate to give them spells and these different abilities that come from other sort of higher entities. go ahead and give your Merrow all kinds of traps. Give them spells. Give them tail abilities. These are things that would likely fit a Merrow, and it's not outside of the realm of disbelief. It doesn't pull you out of the immersion in the moment because it makes sense.
Yeah, Merrow, they largely, because of their nature, and they can be reflections of your standard 5-member party. They may have a tank, they may have a healer, a spellcaster, melee combat. They are effectively humanoids in the same way that your adventurers are, and so being able to have that dimension of NPC enemy creation, I think is not only easy to do with Merrows, but I think it should be encouraged, especially when you have, let's say, a dungeon that is almost completely composed of Merrows. If you want to do that, you can do that, and you can do it with variety. So I would encourage people to utilize them in a lot of different ways.
Give a Merrow some chainmail.
Yeah.
Give him a little bit of a higher armor class, because he can.
Yeah, there are lots of interesting and wondrous things under the sea, and Merrow will have access to that. So why not?
Awesome. Well, Mick Daggers, do you have any personal stories and interactions where you have seen or utilized Merrow for yourself?
Sure. So earlier I did mention the ship tactic. That was a particularly tasty thing that I got to use against a set of adventurers, and it was fun to watch everyone scramble while large tentacles began to suck the ship down into the sea.
Oh yes.
So that was a very fun visual for me. And then, of course, the very classic underwater cave. You have so many motivations for why adventurers would want to, go down. There's the promise of gold or magic items. There's a dark entity that is affecting people's lives on the coast, and it seems to be sourced from this underwater cave. But no one knows what is down there, so adventurers have to go save the day. These for me, those are common situations in which I've used Merrows to great effect.
I've yet to have the opportunity to utilize Merrow in a combat sense. However, I have had a strong Merrow presence in my worlds. I like to use I call it the Void Lake, and it's this massive, not a particularly massive lake, but it's a very large lake that goes straight down and eventually makes its way into the abyss. And the Merrow control certain levels of this Void Lake before it eventually submerges itself into the abyss. I pray that one day my party decides that they want to go take a dive, and I can utilize some of these creatures, but it'll be quite a challenge and something that they will likely have to prepare for quite a while before they take on the endeavor.
Absolutely. And that's what Merrow should be. They should be a fun challenge that really pushes your adventurers to think more. Also, our email is available for you to send us stuff. And maybe you can write your own Merrow one-shot, or you can add a chapter into your already pre-existing module that you've written, and send it to us. We would love to play it. We'd love to talk about it.
Read it.
To do is feature. Yeah, we want to feature people on this channel. So if you've got an adventure that you are dying to share with us. We'd love to share it with others as best we can. So,
well, I believe that is all we have for all of you today. This has been Dungeonmancers Talk of Merrow. Hopefully, it gives you some good ideas to torture and maim some of your party members with Merrow in the future.